In the previous episode, we discovered that funding targets are not guesses, they are outputs, and every funding target is ultimately driven by a future obligation. That naturally raises a new question: what future obligations actually exist? Most households think about the future in isolated pieces: retirement, education, vehicle replacement, maybe an emergency fund. But strategic planning requires a complete inventory, because every future obligation competes for the same scarce resource: capital. In this video, we begin constructing that inventory. When most people think about future obligations, retirement is the first thing that comes to mind. But retirement itself contains multiple obligations: lifestyle spending, healthcare costs, long-term care, unexpected expenses, legacy objectives, support for family members. Retirement is not one obligation, it is an entire system of obligations. Many future obligations originate from family: education, supporting children, helping aging parents, wedding expenses, future caregiving responsibilities. Family obligations often represent some of the largest funding requirements households will ever face. Many homeowners underestimate future housing obligations. A house is not merely an asset, it is also a future consumer of capital. Roofs wear out, windows fail, driveways deteriorate. Appliances require replacement. Ownership creates obligations. Transportation is often treated as a current expense. Strategic planners recognize it is a future obligation. Every vehicle eventually requires replacement. The only uncertainty is when. Not every future obligation is planned. Some exist because uncertainty exists: emergency reserves, insurance deductibles, disaster recovery funds, unexpected healthcare costs. Protection obligations preserve system stability. This category is often ignored, but it may be the most important. Future opportunities often require capital: starting a business, changing careers, relocating, acquiring assets, pursuing education. Freedom frequently arrives carrying a price tag. Some future obligations exist because life should be lived: travel, experiences, hobbies, personal passions. Lifestyle goals deserve intentional planning. The first major distinction is mandatory versus optional obligations. Some obligations preserve survival, others expand possibility. Understanding the difference is essential. The second distinction is timing. Some obligations occur once, others repeat indefinitely. This distinction will become critical when we begin applying time value of money. Future obligations do not remain fixed. Inflation changes them. Technology changes them. Life circumstances change them. The future evolves, which means funding targets must evolve too. Now we can combine everything: retirement, education, housing, transportation, protection, opportunity, lifestyle. Together, they form the household capital requirement map. This is the complete demand side of the planning system. We now have a complete framework. Future obligations create future costs create funding targets create funding adequacy requirements. And in the remainder of this video, we're going to go through each of these different parts in detail. Now, in previous videos, we uncovered a major weakness in the funding adequacy ratio. The problem wasn't the numerator, the problem was the denominator. We discovered that every funding target must come from somewhere: retirement targets, education targets, vehicle replacement targets, opportunity funds, emergency reserves. All of them require a reason. And in episode 1.2, we learned the funding targets are not guesses, they are outputs. They are the result of future obligations. In this video, we take the next step. Before we can calculate funding targets, we must first identify the obligations that create them, because every dollar that must exist in the future belongs somewhere. The purpose of this episode is to create a complete inventory of future obligations. Think of this as building the demand side of the household financial system. In accounting, we identify accounts before we record transactions. In operations management, we identify requirements before we allocate resources. And in financial planning, we must identify future obligations before we determine funding targets. So in this video, we begin building that map. One of the biggest mistakes households make is viewing financial planning as a series of isolated decisions. They think, I need to save for retirement, I need to buy a car, I need an emergency fund, I want to travel. Each objective is considered separately, but reality doesn't work that way. All of these obligations exist simultaneously. The future is not one event, it is a collection of overlapping obligations competing for the same pool of resources. This is why so many households feel financially stressed, not because they lack goals, but because they have never mapped all of their future obligations in one place. The moment we begin mapping the future, something important happens. We stop asking, how much should I save, and start asking, what am I actually trying to fund? This is a much better question. When most people think about future obligations, retirement is usually the first thing that comes to mind. But retirement itself is often misunderstood. People talk about retirement as if it were a single number, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. But retirement is not a number. Retirement is a system. The number is simply the output of that system. Consider everything that retirement might include: daily living expenses, housing, transportation, healthcare, long-term care, travel, leisure, supporting family members, charitable giving, legacy objectives, unexpected expenses. Each of these components create future funding requirements, and together they form the retirement obligation. This is why two households retiring at age 65 can require dramatically different amounts of capital, because they are not funding the same future. They are funding different systems. The second major category is family. Family obligations often become some of the largest capital requirements a household will ever face. Children may require education funding. Parents may eventually require care. There may be weddings, there may be family emergencies, there may be financial support during difficult periods. There may be gifts or inheritances. Family obligations are unique because they are often voluntary. Nobody can force you to pay for a child's education. Nobody can force you to help an aging parent. Yet many people feel these obligations deeply, which means they belong inside the planning framework. If something is important enough that you would likely spend money on it, it belongs on the future obligation map. One of the most misunderstood future obligations is housing. Many people view a home purely as an asset. And it is an asset, but it is also a future consumer of capital. A house constantly demands resources. Roofs wear out, furnaces fail, windows require replacement, driveways deteriorate. Kitchens become outdated, bathrooms need renovation, property taxes continue, insurance continues, maintenance never completely disappears. Ownership creates obligations. The larger the home, the more complex the home, and the older the home, the greater those obligations tend to become. Housing is both an asset and a future liability generator. Strong planning recognizes both sides of that reality. Transportation is another category that often gets underestimated. Most people focus on the current vehicle payment, but the strategic planner sees something different. They see a replacement cycle. Every vehicle eventually reaches the end of its useful life. Every vehicle must eventually be replaced. Some households may replace vehicles every 5 years, others every 10, others still every 15. The specific timeline matters less than the principle. Transportation is not a one-time event. It is a recurring future obligation. And over a lifetime, vehicle replacement may consume hundreds of thousands of dollars. Transportation is not today's car. Transportation is the entire sequence of future cars. Not all obligations are planned. Some exist because uncertainty exists. These are protection obligations: emergency funds, insurance deductibles, income disruption reserves, medical contingencies, disaster recovery reserves, legal contingencies. Protection obligations serve a unique purpose. Their job is not to create growth, their job is to preserve stability. They are the shock absorbers of the household financial system. Without them, small surprises become large crises. This category may be the most important. Most financial plans focus on protection. Few focus on opportunity, yet opportunity often determines long-term wealth creation. A business opportunity, a career transition, a relocation, a professional designation, a business acquisition, an investment opportunity during a market downturn. Each of these may require capital. Without capital, opportunity is often impossible to pursue. This is why optionality matters. Optionality is simply the ability to choose, and choice frequently requires resources. Opportunity funds are not merely savings accounts, they are freedom reserves. The final category is lifestyle. Too many financial plans focus entirely on survival. But the purpose of money is not merely to survive. It is also to live. Travel, experiences, hobbies, recreation, adventure, personal fulfillment. Lifestyle obligations deserve a place in the framework because they represent the life being funded. Without them, financial planning becomes an exercise in accumulation without purpose. So to round out this section, we built the first version of the future obligation framework. We identified 7 major categories: retirement obligations, 1, 2, family obligations, 3, housing obligations, 4, transportation obligations, 5, protection obligations, 6, opportunity obligations, and 7, lifestyle obligations. Together, these categories form the demand side of the household financial system. Before we can determine funding targets, we must know what requires funding. Before we can allocate capital, we must know where capital is needed. Before we can calculate the future, we must understand its structure. And now that we understand the categories of future obligations, we can begin organizing them. Because not all obligations are equal. Some are mandatory, some are optional. And that distinction changes everything. In the next component, we'll explore mandatory versus optional future obligations and begin prioritizing the future itself. In the previous section, we built the future obligation framework. We learned that the future is not empty, it is filled with obligations. Retirement obligations, family obligations, housing obligations, transportation obligations, protection obligations, opportunity obligations, lifestyle obligations. But now we need to organize them, because not all obligations have the same priority. Some obligations protect stability, others expand possibility. Some must be funded. Others are chosen because they represent the life we want to build. In this section, we separate future obligations into 2 major categories: mandatory obligations and optional obligations. This distinction matters because financial planning is not just about identifying future costs, it is about prioritizing them. Mandatory obligations are the future costs that protect the household's basic stability. These are the obligations that cannot be ignored without creating serious financial risk. Housing, food, utilities, healthcare, transportation, insurance, emergency reserves, debt repayment, basic retirement security. These obligations form the foundation of the household financial system. Without them, the household becomes fragile. A household may be able to delay a vacation, it may be able to postpone a luxury purchase, it may be able to wait before starting a business, but it cannot ignore food, shelter, health care, mobility, or long-term income security. Mandatory obligations protect survival. They protect stability, they protect dignity, they protect the household's ability to function. Optional obligations are different. They are not usually required for survival, but they may be required for the life you actually want. Travel, hobbies, lifestyle upgrades, second priorities, entrepreneurship, career change, business acquisitions, major experiences, legacy giving. These obligations are optional because they are chosen. But chosen does not mean unimportant. Optional obligations often represent purpose, freedom, growth, meaning, and impact. They are the reason why many people care about financial independence in the first place. The goal is not simply to survive the future. The goal is to design a future worth living. The order matters. Mandatory obligations generally come first because they protect the system. Optional obligations come later because they expand the system. This does not mean optional obligations are ignored. It means they should not destabilize the foundation. A household that funds luxury travel while ignoring emergency reserves is increasing fragility. A household that starts a business without liquidity may be creating unnecessary risk. A household that upgrades lifestyle while underfunding retirement may be borrowing comfort from the future. The principle is simple: stability before optionality. You build the foundation first, then you expand freedom. This is where financial planning becomes strategic. Two households can earn the same income and end up with completely different futures. One household uses income to fund stability first: emergency reserves, retirement insurance, debt reduction, housing and maintenance. Then it expands into travel, opportunities, and lifestyle. The other household funds optional spending first: better cars, more travel, more lifestyle upgrades, more consumption. But the mandatory obligations remain underfunded. On the surface, the second household may appear to have a better lifestyle, but underneath, the system may be fragile. This is why priorities matter. Financial strength is not only about how much money flows in, it is about where the money goes. A useful way to think about this is through layers. Layer 1 is survival: food, shelter, healthcare, basic transportation. Layer 2 is resilience: emergency reserves, insurance, debt control, income protection. Layer 3 is long-term security: retirement funding, housing maintenance, education planning, future replacement needs. Layer 4 is optionality: career flexibility, entrepreneurship, relocation, investment opportunities. Layer 5 is fulfillment: travel, lifestyle, legacy, experiences, personal goals. Each layer depends on the layer beneath it. Freedom becomes stronger when it rests on security. In practice, obligations are not always purely mandatory or purely optional. Some fall in the middle. That gives us three useful categories. Required obligations are non-negotiable. These include basic living costs, healthcare, housing, transportation, and minimum retirement security. Flexible obligations are important but adjustable. Education support, home renovations, family support, and vehicle replacement may be necessary, but the timing, size, or method can often change. Aspirational obligations are chosen goals. Travel, second properties, luxury purchases, entrepreneurship, and legacy projects may matter deeply, but they depend on available capital and household priorities. This three-part framework gives us more precision: required, flexible, aspirational. Not all future obligations have the same urgency. This distinction becomes essential later in Season 4, because once we understand which obligations are mandatory and which are optional, we can allocate capital more intelligently. Mandatory obligations usually require dependable funding, stable assets, consistent contributions, lower risk, clear timelines. Optional obligations may allow more flexibility. They may be delayed, reduced, changed, or funded only after stronger priorities are secure. This is the beginning of capital allocation, not simply asking, where should I put my money, but asking which future obligations deserve funding first. Capital must follow purpose. So to conclude this section, we separated future obligations into two broad categories: mandatory obligations and optional obligations. Mandatory obligations protect stability. Optional obligations create possibility. Mandatory obligations defend the foundation. Optional obligations expand freedom. But the strongest financial plans do not ignore either side. They fund security first, then they intentionally build freedom. In the next section, we add another layer to the framework, because future obligations differ not only by priority, they also differ by timing. Some costs happen once, others never stop. In the previous section, we learned that not all future obligations are equal. Some are mandatory, some are optional, some protect stability, some create freedom. In this section, we introduce another critical distinction. Not all obligations behave the same through time. Some obligations occur once, others occur repeatedly. This distinction matters because future obligations must eventually become funding targets, and funding targets are calculated differently depending on the nature of the obligation. A child's university education is not funded the same way as retirement. A wedding is not funded the same way as healthcare. A roof replacement is not funded the same way as annual property taxes. Why? Because some future costs occur once, others continue indefinitely. So in this section, we learn how to classify future obligations based on their timing characteristics. Because before we can calculate future funding targets, we must understand the type of obligation we are trying to fund. Imagine two future obligations. The first is your child's university education beginning in 10 years. The second is your retirement spending beginning in 30 years. Both are future obligations, both require capital, but they behave very differently. Education has a defined start date, a defined duration, and eventually ends. Retirement begins at a point in time, but may continue for decades. One is finite, one is ongoing. One resembles a project, the other resembles an income stream. The mathematics are different, the planning process is different, and the funding targets will be different. This is why the first step is classification. A one-time obligation is a future cost that occurs at a specific point in time. It may be large, it may be small, but it occurs once. Examples include a child's university education, a wedding, a vehicle purchase, a roof replacement, a furnace replacement, a business acquisition, a down payment on a home, a major family event. The defining characteristic is simple. The obligation has a future date and a target amount. Once it occurs, the obligation is complete. Think about replacing your roof. Perhaps the roof will need replacement 15 years from now. The planning question becomes how much money will be required on that date. That is fundamentally different from retirement planning. One requires a future lump sum, the other requires ongoing cash flows. One-time obligations can often be viewed as projects. Projects have a start date, a target date, a cost estimate, a funding requirement. This is how engineers think. This is how project managers think. And increasingly, this is how strategic financial planning should think. University funding is a project. A major renovation is a project. A future vehicle replacement is a project. The purpose of planning is not simply to hope the money exists when the project arrives. The purpose is to deliberately build the required capital before the obligation appears. Recurring obligations behave differently. Instead of occurring once, they repeat. Examples include retirement spending, healthcare expenses, insurance costs, property taxes, transportation expenses, utilities, food, ongoing family support, lifestyle spending. The challenge is not funding one event. The challenge is funding an entire stream of events. Think about retirement. Retirement is not one withdrawal. It is thousands of future withdrawals. This is why retirement funding is significantly more complex than funding a future vehicle purchase. The vehicle purchase requires one lump sum. Retirement requires a future income stream. Many households underestimate retirement because they think about it incorrectly. They imagine retirement as a large number, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. But retirement is not a number. Retirement is a stream. The future spending exists because future life exists. This is why retirement funding eventually requires concepts such as present value, future value, annuities, withdrawal rates, life expectancy, inflation adjustments. Those concepts do not matter nearly as much when funding a single roof replacement. The structure of the obligation determines the mathematics. Some obligations do not fit perfectly into either category. They are cyclical. Vehicle replacement is a good example. You replace the vehicle once, but eventually you replace it again and again and again. A roof replacement behaves similarly. So does furnace replacements. So do major renovations. These obligations appear as a series of one-time events that repeat over long periods. Strategically, they occupy a middle ground between project-based obligations and recurring obligations. Understanding this distinction helps us create more accurate forecasts. This distinction becomes extremely important in the coming module. Because the next module introduces the time value of money toolkit, and different obligations require different time value of money tools. One-time obligations often require future value calculations. Recurring obligations often require annuity calculations. Income streams, present value calculations, withdrawal models, funding schedules. The type of obligation determines the mathematical tool, and the mathematical tool determines the funding target. We can now classify obligations into three broad groups. One-time obligations, such as university education, weddings, home down payment, business acquisition, major renovations. Recurring obligations, retirement spending, healthcare spending, insurance, housing expenses, transportation expenses, and lifestyle spending. And cyclical obligations, vehicle replacements, roof replacements, furnace replacements, appliance replacements, major maintenance events. This framework will guide everything that follows, because different obligations require different funding strategies. In this section, we learned that future obligations differ not only by priority, but also by timing. Some obligations occur once, some occur forever, some repeat in cycles. This distinction matters because future obligations eventually become funding targets, and funding targets eventually become mathematical calculations. Before we can calculate those targets, we must understand the structure of the obligation itself, because the model follows the obligation. In the next section, we introduce another major complication. Even if we know the future obligation, the cost itself does not stay constant. Education costs change, healthcare costs change, housing costs change. Everything changes through time, and that means the future funding target changes too. In the last section, we learned that future obligations fall into three categories: one-time obligations, recurring obligations, and cyclical obligations. But as mentioned, there's still a major problem. Even if we know exactly what future obligation we are trying to fund, we still do not know what it will cost, because the future is not static. A university education 10 years from now will not cost what it costs today. Healthcare costs 30 years from now will not cost what they cost today. A roof replacement 15 years from now will not cost what it costs today. And retirement spending 30 years from now will not require the same amount of income as it does today. Time changes the price tag. In this section, we introduce one of the most important concepts in finance: future costs grow. And understanding that growth is the difference between accurate planning and dangerous underfunding. Most people naturally think in today's dollars. A roof costs $20,000 perhaps. University costs $15,000 per year. Retirement spending requires $60,000 annually. A vehicle costs $45,000. These numbers feel real because they exist today. But future planning is not about today's dollars. Future planning is about future dollars. And future dollars are affected by growth. The longer the planning horizon, the more important this becomes. A small annual increase may seem insignificant, but over decades, the difference becomes enormous. This is why today's cost is merely the starting point. It is not the target. Many people understand compounding when discussing investments. Few appreciate compounding when discussing expenses. But expenses compound too. If a cost increases by 3% annually, it does not simply rise by 3%. Each year's increase becomes part of the base for the next increase. The effect compounds: 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Eventually, the future cost can become dramatically larger than today's cost. This means every future obligation must be projected forward before it becomes a funding target. Otherwise, the target will be too small. One of the biggest mistakes in financial planning is assuming every cost grows at the same rate. In reality, different categories often experience different inflation rates. Education costs may rise faster than general inflation. Healthcare costs may rise faster than general inflation. Housing costs may rise faster than general inflation. Meanwhile, other expenses may rise more slowly. This means we cannot simply apply one inflation rate to every future obligation. Different obligations may require different assumptions. The obligation determines the growth rate. The growth rate influences the target, and the target influences the funding plan. Retirement provides the perfect example. Suppose a household requires $70,000 annually today. If retirement begins 30 years from now, that household will likely require far more than $70,000 annually, not because they are consuming more, but because prices have changed. The retirement target must reflect future spending needs, not current spending needs. This is why retirement funding targets are heavily influenced by inflation assumptions. The retirement target is not simply a function of retirement age and life expectancy. It is also a function of future purchasing power. Another important distinction, not every future increase comes from inflation. Some obligations grow because the goal itself changes. A family may initially plan to support a child through college. Later, they may want to fund graduate school. An entrepreneur may initially plan a small business. Later, they may pursue a larger acquisition. A retiree may revise lifestyle expectations upward. These are not inflation effects, they are growth effects. The obligation itself becomes larger. This is why future planning requires both inflation assumptions and growth assumptions. Every future funding target depends on assumptions: inflation assumptions, growth assumptions, healthcare assumptions, education assumptions, lifestyle assumptions, and assumptions are never perfect. This does not mean planning is impossible. It means planning must be flexible. Good planners understand that the future is uncertain, but they also understand that uncertainty is not an excuse for inaction. The goal is not perfect prediction. The goal is reasonable preparation. We can now see the next step in the process. Step 1, identify the obligation. Step 2, classify the obligation. Step 3, determine how the obligation changes through time. Step 4, estimate its future value. Only then can we begin calculating the fund target. This is one of the most important transitions in the entire season, because for the first time we move from identifying future obligations to quantifying them. The obligation begins to acquire a price tag, and that price tag becomes the basis for future funding. So to conclude this section, we learned that future obligations are not static. Costs change, prices change, goals change. Inflation changes purchasing power, and time magnifies all of these effects. This means future obligations must be projected forward before they can become funding targets, because today's cost is not the future cost. In the next section, we bring everything together. We combine all future obligations, all future costs, and all future funding requirements into a single framework. For the first time, we will see the complete demand side of the household financial system. Throughout this module, we have been building toward a single objective, understanding the denominator. The funding adequacy ratio cannot exist without funding targets. Funding targets cannot exist without future obligations. Future obligations cannot be understood until we identify what they are, whether they are mandatory or optional, whether they are one-time or recurring, how they change through time, and what they may ultimately cost. In this section, we bring everything together. For the first time, we build the Household Capital Requirement Map. This map represents every future claim on household capital, every future obligation, every future cost, every future goal, every future responsibility, displayed as a single integrated system. Because before we can determine how much capital we need, we must understand what is demanding it. Most households think about obligations individually: retirement, education, a future vehicle, home repairs, a vacation, a business idea. But the household does not fund these obligations individually. The household funds them collectively. Every future obligation competes for the same pool of capital: future savings, future cash flow, future investment returns, future income. The moment we recognize this, everything changes. We stop viewing obligations as isolated events and begin viewing them as competing claims on resources. This is how capital allocators think. This is how CFOs think. This is how strategic planners think. Imagine a household with retirement funding requirements, children's education, future vehicle replacements, home maintenance reserves, healthcare reserves, emergency reserves, travel goals, entrepreneurial ambitions. Each objective may be perfectly reasonable. The challenge is that all of them require capital, and capital is limited. This means every dollar allocated toward one objective is unavailable for another. This is the foundation of opportunity cost, and it begins long before investing. It begins with future obligations. To create the household capital requirements map, we begin by grouping obligations. First, retirement system, retirement spending, health care, long-term care, legacy objectives. Family system, education, family support, intergenerational assistance. Housing system, roofs, furnaces, renovations, maintenance. Transportation system, vehicle replacement, insurance, mobility requirements. Protection system, emergency reserves, insurance gaps, contingency reserves. Opportunity system, business creation, career transitions, relocation, acquisitions. And lifestyle system, travel, recreation, personal goals. These categories become the major demand centers within the household. Once obligations are mapped, patterns emerge. Certain years become crowded. A child enters university, a roof requires replacement, a vehicle needs replacing. Retirement approaches, healthcare costs begin rising, multiple obligations collide. This creates funding pressure. Many households never identify these pressure points because they never map the future. The capital requirement map reveals them immediately. The map is not merely descriptive, it is diagnostic. It helps answer questions such as where will capital be needed, when will capital be needed, how much capital will be needed, which obligations create the greatest pressure, which obligations are underfunded, which obligations are flexible, which obligations are mandatory. Without the map, these questions remain hidden. With the map, they become visible. This is where the season begins transitioning. Until now, we have focused on demand, future obligations, future costs, future targets. Soon, we will focus on supply, savings, investments, returns, capital allocation, portfolio construction. But before we can decide where capital should go, we must understand what is demanding it. The capital requirement map is the bridge between those two worlds. We now possess every major component required to create funding targets. We have future obligations, classification systems, growth assumptions, inflation assumptions, timing structures, future cost estimates. The next step is transforming those future costs into formal funding targets. That process creates the denominator, and the denominator creates funding adequacy. So to conclude this section, we built the household capital requirement map. For the first time, every future obligation exists within a single integrated framework. We can see what the future demands, when it demands it, and how much capital it may require. This is the complete demand side of the household financial system. In the next section, we assemble everything we have built throughout Module 1. We move from obligations to targets, from targets to adequacy, from planning concepts to a complete strategic framework. Throughout this module, we have been solving a problem hidden inside funding adequacy. When we first introduced funding adequacy in Season 3, the calculation appeared straightforward. Funding adequacy equals actual funding divided by required funding. The ratio appeared simple, but there was a hidden question. Where does the required funding number come from? That question launched the entire first module of Season 4. Today, we answer it completely. Because funding adequacy is not a ratio, it is the final output of an entire planning system. And in this video, we reveal that system. Most financial planning begins with money. This framework begins somewhere different. It begins with the future, specifically what future obligations exist, what future responsibilities exist, what future goals exist, what future opportunities exist. Before we discuss investing, before we discuss savings, before we discuss asset allocation, we first ask what future is being funded, because every funding target begins with an obligation. After identifying future obligations, we classify them. We ask, is it mandatory or optional? Is it one-time or recurring? Is it cyclical? Is it flexible? Is it essential? Classification matters because different obligations require different planning models. A vehicle replacement behaves differently than retirement. A wedding behaves differently than healthcare. A roof behaves differently than a pension income stream. The obligation determines the structure. Once we understand the obligation, we ask, what will it cost in the future? This introduces inflation, healthcare inflation, education inflation, housing inflation, lifestyle growth, changing expectations. Future costs rarely equal today's costs. The obligation must be projected forward. Only then can we estimate the future requirement. After projecting every obligation forward, we combine them. Now we can see retirement demands, education demands, housing demands, healthcare demands, transportation demands, opportunity demands, and lifestyle demands, all competing for capital. This creates the household capital requirement map. For the first time, we can see the complete demand side of the household financial system. Now we can finally determine the targets. Each obligation produces a funding requirement. Each funding requirement contributes to a target. The targets are not guesses, they are outputs. Outputs generated by assumptions, outputs generated by obligations, outputs generated by future demands. This is why two households with identical income may require completely different funding targets, because they are funding different futures. Only now do we arrive at the ratio. Funding adequacy equals actual funding divided by the required funding. Notice where the ratio appears, at the end, not the beginning. Everything we learn in Module 1 exists to create the denominator, because the denominator is the future. The denominator is the obligation, the denominator is the target. Without the target, the ratio has no meaning. We can now express the entire framework. Future obligations lead to classification. Classification leads to inflation and growth assumptions. That leads to future cost estimates, which leads to capital requirement map, which leads to funding targets, which leads to funding adequacy. This is the complete architecture. Everything we built in Module 1 serves this sequence. And now the denominator problem is solved. Module 1 was never about funding adequacy. It was about understanding where funding adequacy comes from. We now understand why targets exist, how targets are created, why different households need different targets, why obligations determine capital requirements, and why the denominator matters. In the next module, we begin building the mathematical toolkit required to calculate these targets. Because knowing the future obligation is only the beginning. The next question is, how do we determine what today's dollars must become tomorrow? In the next episode, we explore that, why a dollar tomorrow is not a dollar today.